Funeral homes, places we associate with sorrow, grief, and the end of life, are often seen as final resting places where the dead are laid to rest and loved ones mourn. But what if these spaces are also home to something far darker? What if, in the quiet halls and behind the doors of these seemingly peaceful sanctuaries, there are stories that go beyond the natural realm? In this video, we're about to delve into a world that many of us rarely think about: the eerie, unsettling occurrences that have been reported in funeral homes across the globe. From strange noises and unexplained shadows to chilling encounters with spirits and forces beyond our understanding, these places are not as peaceful as they may seem. The people who work in funeral homes are often the unsung heroes of society. They help families navigate the difficult process of laying their loved ones to rest. But their jobs aren't without their own set of challenges, and some workers have encountered things that defy logic and reason. Imagine working in a place where the dead and the living are in such close proximity, and where the air itself can feel thick with tension. But these aren't just stories made up to frighten us. These are real-life experiences, shared by those who've worked in these places. As you listen to these chilling accounts, you may find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about death, the afterlife, and the things that lurk in the shadows of our everyday world. Now, brace yourself as we step into the unknown and explore the hidden mysteries of funeral homes, where the boundary between life and death is often more fragile than we imagine. Story 1. The Corridor of Death. The night had fallen silent as Jason, a long-time employee at one of the oldest funeral homes in the city, prepared for another routine shift. He had worked there for over 5 years, a place that he had come to know inside and out. The hallways, the embalming rooms, and the viewing areas were all familiar to him, and though the smell of formaldehyde and the sight of the deceased could be unsettling at first, Jason had grown accustomed to it. He was used to the stillness of the place, even found comfort in it. But that night, something felt different. It was just after midnight when Jason first heard the sound. At first, he thought it was his imagination, perhaps the house settling or the air conditioning kicking on. But as the footsteps grew louder, more distinct and closer, Jason's pulse quickened. He stood frozen, listening carefully as the footsteps echoed down the long corridor. There was no one else in the building. The funeral home was empty, save for him and the deceased. Confused and a little unnerved, Jason grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the hallway where the sound seemed to be coming from. The corridor was long, stretching from the viewing rooms at one end to the embalming area at the other. It was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the flickering fluorescent bulbs above. As he moved down the hallway, the footsteps seemed to stop, only for the sound to pick up again, closer this time. Jason hesitated at the door to the embalming room. The noise had stopped again, but there was an odd tension in the air. He pushed open the door slowly, the hinges creaking in the quiet. Inside, everything appeared as it should be, the bodies on the gurneys, the equipment neatly arranged. But there was something unsettling about the stillness. It wasn't the peaceful stillness that came with a room full of the departed. It was something off. Suddenly, a sharp sound, like a metallic clang, echoed from the far end of the room. Jason spun around, his heart pounding. His flashlight swept over the empty room, settling on a gurney in the corner where a body was lying. Or at least, it had been lying there just moments ago. The body had shifted slightly, its position slightly altered as though it had moved on its own. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't explain it. It was as if the very air around him had grown heavier, as though something invisible was pressing down on him. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He quickly turned and exited the room, his heart racing. As Jason stood in the hallway trying to catch his breath, the footsteps returned. But this time, they weren't just distant echoes. They were right behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty corridor stretching out behind him. Shaken, Jason made his way to the office, locking the door behind him. He sat down at his desk, trying to calm himself. He had been working alone in this funeral home for years, but never had he felt such an eerie presence. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew he hadn't been alone. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. That something or someone was still there. And every time he passed through that long corridor, he couldn't help but wonder, what had moved those bodies? What had left those footsteps? As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Jason swore he would never work that late shift again. Story 2: The Room of the Departed. It wasn't the first time Jeremy had worked late at the funeral home. In fact, it was almost a routine for him, staying after hours, making sure everything was in order before the next day's services. But tonight was different. There was an odd stillness in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. The night started like any other. Jeremy went through his usual checks, securing the rooms, making sure the bodies were prepared for viewing, and ensuring the temperature controls were functioning properly. But when he entered the back room, the one that held the most recently embalmed bodies, something felt off. The room was typically cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. But tonight, the coldness felt more oppressive, more unnatural. The bodies, neatly arranged on their gurneys, seemed perfectly still. But there was a sense of movement. At first, Jeremy thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on him, but as he stood there, his eyes drawn to the farthest corner of the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A body on one of the gurneys had shifted. It wasn't much, just a slight movement, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through Jeremy. The arm that had been resting at the side of the body was now hanging loosely over the edge of the gurney. But what really made Jeremy's stomach churn was the look of the body's face. It seemed different. The features were almost contorted, as though the person had been caught in the midst of a grimace. He approached the gurney cautiously, his breath shallow. As he drew closer, the feeling of being watched intensified. He looked down at the body, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. It was a man, a middle-aged individual who had passed away earlier that evening. There was no reason for him to look so different. His eyes were closed, his lips slightly parted, as if frozen in some horrific expression. Jeremy's mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Perhaps it was just the embalming process, he told himself. Sometimes the muscles could tighten or shift slightly as the body cooled. But this felt wrong. Too wrong. Suddenly, the room temperature seemed to drop even further, and Jeremy felt a coldness wash over him, like the air had become thick with something heavy, something that wasn't supposed to be there. It felt like the very atmosphere had changed, like he was no longer alone. He tried to shake the feeling off, telling himself it was just the natural fear of being alone in such a somber place, but deep down, he knew that wasn't it. The silence was broken when a faint sound reached his ears, a soft whisper, almost imperceptible. At first, Jeremy thought it was the wind or the building settling, but the whisper came again, louder this time. It was a low, guttural murmur, like a voice trying to break through the silence. The words were unintelligible, but they sounded desperate. The hairs on Jeremy's arms stood up as he turned toward the source of the sound, but there was no one. Just the bodies, lying still and silent in the dim light. Panic began to rise in Jeremy's chest. The whispering was becoming more distinct, and the temperature was dropping further. His breath became visible in the air, and the chill in the room was now unbearable. The lights flickered once, then twice, before suddenly cutting out, plunging the room into total darkness. In the pitch-black silence, Jeremy heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across the floor. It was coming from behind him. He spun around, his flashlight now flickering in the darkness. The light barely illuminated the room, but in that fleeting moment, Jeremy saw it. One of the bodies on the gurney had moved. The arm, once dangling over the side, was now reaching up toward him. Frozen in place, Jeremy could feel the presence behind him, just out of reach. The whispering, now louder and more frantic, filled his ears. With a surge of adrenaline, he ran out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The lights flickered back on, and the temperature seemed to return to normal. But Jeremy couldn't shake the image of the body reaching for him. He didn't return to that room that night. Story 3. The Whispering Shadows. Megan had always been skeptical about the supernatural. She was a practical woman, grounded in reality, and didn't easily believe in ghost stories or haunted places. But after her experiences at the funeral home where she worked, she found her beliefs changing, shifting into something more, uncertain. It had started innocently enough. Megan had been employed at the funeral home for just a few months. She was familiar with the routines of preparing the bodies and organizing the viewing rooms, but she wasn't prepared for what she would encounter during one late-night shift. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Megan was finishing up the last tasks of her night shift. She was alone in the building, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator units and the occasional creak of the old wood floors breaking the silence. As she walked down the main corridor toward the storage area, something caught her eye, just at the edge of the hallway. A shadow, moving quickly, almost too quickly to be natural. At first, Megan dismissed it as a trick of the light or her mind playing tricks on her due to the quiet of the night. But then, the whispering started. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint murmur. But as she continued down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and more unnerving. They were coming from the storage area, where the bodies were stored before being prepared for embalming. The sound was like 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, but in a language that Megan couldn't understand. It was a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to vibrate the very air around her. Frozen in place, Megan strained her ears trying to make out the words, but as she did, the whispers stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening, and it sent a chill down her spine. She took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence was unnerving, and the shadows around her seemed to stretch unnaturally. As she approached the storage area, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air felt thick, as though something heavy was pressing down on her. Her breath misted in front of her, even though it wasn't cold enough to cause condensation. Megan tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up her spine, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks. But then, just as she was about to turn and leave, a loud bang echoed through the hallway. The door to the storage room had slammed shut, as if something, had been trying to get out. Megan's heart raced as she rushed to the door and yanked it open. Inside, the room was empty, the bodies still laid out on their gurneys, but there was an undeniable presence in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. For a moment, Megan swore she saw something moving in the corner of her eye. A figure just beyond her reach, standing perfectly still, watching her. She spun around, but no one was there. Still, the sensation of being watched lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Megan's mind raced as she backed away from the storage area, the whispers starting again. This time, louder, more desperate, as if the voices were begging for her attention. With a final, terrified glance toward the shadows, Megan ran toward the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers followed her, fading only when she finally stepped outside into the cool night air. After that night, Megan could never shake the feeling that something had followed her from the funeral home, something that still lingered in the corners of her mind. She never worked another late shift alone, and she couldn't explain the strange experiences she had witnessed. Were they simply the result of her imagination? Or was there truly something supernatural lingering in the very walls of the funeral home? After the strange occurrences that Megan experienced that night, she found herself haunted not just by the whispers and shadows, but by the psychological toll it took on her. In the days that followed, her colleagues noticed a shift in her behavior. Megan, who had once been confident and composed, seemed distant, lost in thought, and visibly shaken. She had always been someone who took pride in her ability to stay grounded, but now even the smallest sound made her jump. It wasn't just the fear of the supernatural that weighed on her mind. It was the question of what she had experienced. What was real? What was her mind playing tricks on her? And more importantly, what had she witnessed in that funeral home? There were no clear answers, only an eerie uncertainty that gnawed at her every time she walked into that place. The funeral home, which had once seemed like just another job to her, now felt like a maze of hidden corners, darkened rooms, and strange energies. The shadow that had darted down the hallway now lingered in her thoughts, and the whispering voices, though silent, echoed in the back of her mind. She tried to convince herself that it was just the stress of the job, the isolation of working long hours in a quiet building, but deep down, she knew something else was at play. The psychological impact was profound. Megan couldn't sleep without the images of the funeral home creeping into her dreams. Faces of the deceased twisted in unnatural ways, figures standing in dark corners, and the constant feeling of being watched. The fear that had taken root inside her mind was no longer confined to the building. It followed her home, where every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, seemed to echo with the same unease she had felt in the funeral home. And it wasn't just Megan. Her colleagues had begun to notice strange things too. One worker swore he'd seen a figure standing at the end of the hallway during a late-night shift. Another had heard faint whispers echoing through the halls, even though no one was there. The more they spoke about it, the more it seemed like the funeral home had a life of its own, one that was far darker than anyone could have imagined. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect was the realization that the supernatural forces in these places weren't just malevolent spirits or ghostly apparitions. They were something else, something far more unsettling. The boundary between life and death, so thin and fragile in a place like this, had blurred. The dead were no longer just the departed. They had become something more, something that reached across the veil to make their presence known. For Megan and others who worked at the funeral home, the fear and the uncertainty became an inseparable part of their daily lives. They would continue to work day after day in a place where the line between the living and the dead was constantly shifting, never quite the same. And though Megan would eventually leave the funeral home, the feeling of dread would never leave her, because some experiences, some places, leave a mark on the soul that never quite fades. Leaving the funeral home was a decision Megan never took lightly. It wasn't the job itself that had driven her to quit. It was the constant, unnerving feeling that something was not right. The fear and dread that had followed her in that place had become all-consuming. She couldn't escape the feeling that there were things in the dark, things that could never be explained by logic or reason. And once she left, it didn't just vanish. In the weeks following her departure, Megan tried to return to a normal life, but the psychological toll of her experiences lingered. She couldn't sleep without nightmares about the funeral home, each dream more vivid and terrifying than the last. Faces from the viewing rooms would appear to her, twisted in agony, their eyes following her as she moved. The whispering voices would start faintly at first, growing louder with each passing night, filling her mind with an eerie, disembodied presence. The fear was no longer confined to her dreams. Megan started noticing strange things happening in her home. Objects would move on their own, lights flickered without reason, and doors that were firmly closed would swing open when she wasn't looking. The atmosphere around her seemed charged, as though something invisible was present, just out of her reach. She tried talking to her friends and family about what was happening, but no one seemed to understand. They dismissed it as stress or overactive imagination. But deep down, Megan knew what she had experienced, and no amount of rationalization could take that away. The boundaries between the physical and the spiritual had become too blurred for her to ignore. Megan eventually sought therapy, not only to deal with the lingering effects of the supernatural events, but also to address the trauma of working in a funeral home, a place where death was not just an abstract concept, but a daily reality. She began to understand the psychological impact of dealing with the deceased, the constant exposure to grief, and the sense of detachment that often accompanies such work. The emotional toll of being surrounded by death on a daily basis could leave anyone feeling fractured, especially when strange, unexplainable events began to blur the line between the living and the dead. As part of her healing process, Megan learned to confront the unknown. She started reading about paranormal experiences and spoke with others who had encountered similar occurrences in places of death. What she discovered was both comforting and unsettling. She wasn't alone. There were many who had worked in funeral homes or hospitals who had witnessed inexplicable things, unseen forces, disembodied voices, and even the sensation of being touched by something that wasn't there. These experiences, although deeply unsettling, were more common than she had initially believed. They were not just isolated incidents, but a part of the human experience that few were willing to acknowledge. Megan's journey toward understanding wasn't about finding answers, because some things, she realized, would never be explained. It was about accepting the unknown, living with it, and learning how to cope with the fear and the uncertainty. Over time, the whispers grew quieter, the shadows less frequent. The paranormal events that had plagued her slowly began to subside, though the memories would stay with her forever. The trauma of the funeral home faded, but the question remained. Why did these places seem to attract the supernatural? Was it the spirits of the departed still lingering? Or was there something about the space itself, a crossroads between life and death, that made it a magnet for the unknown? For Megan, the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that she survived. She had lived to tell the tale. And while she would never be the same, she had learned how to move on, even when the world around her remained haunted by the invisible forces that she could never fully comprehend.